What's up, guys? We're taking a look at this Rocware RC20 PTZ camera, and I really haven't messed around with a lot of PTZ cameras. Rockware did reach out to me and ask me to review this thing for them, so this has been provided to me for free. I'm not at all affiliated with Rockware, and this is a fair and honest review. But with that out of the way, I did want to mention that I'm pretty impressed with this camera. More so than the image quality, I'm impressed with all of the other little things that this camera can do, especially at its price point of around $250, which there are premium webcams that cost more than that now. What I really like about this camera is all the functionality that you get with the remote, and we'll go through that here in a minute. But the reason that I took a look at this camera in the first place was because I've done a couple of builds for some churches who don't really have a lot of money to spend on buying new equipment, and the first question is always, what's the cheapest and best camera we can get? And I think that this is a viable solution, especially all that it can do, around a price point of, at this time, around $250. The big thing that you need for a lot of churches is that they don't want a camera in between the audience and the preacher, so they will have a camera in the back, and you're either stuck with a really wide shot or you're stuck with digital zoom, which is not very good. Well, this camera has optical zoom, and I'm going to zoom in a bit, and we're going to take a look at the zoom capabilities of this camera. Again, as I mentioned, this is optical zoom, so it's really handy to have in a camera when you're trying to zoom in on something, because you're not going to lose image quality like you do with a digital zoom. But here we go. Coming in a little bit here, and let's check out the autofocus. So it doesn't autofocus super fast. It's not really like what I would call super snappy autofocus, but when it does get that focus, it stays locked on and it keeps the focus. So that's good. I'm going to zoom in all the way, and this close, I would imagine the focus is going to have problems. Well, I guess I'm a liar there, because it picked me up right away. So we can see all of my nasty pores and all of my hairs with no problem. That's a pretty good image. I'm going to come back out, and we've also got some tilt, or some pan and tilt, and you can take a look at my old ugly ceiling here. I haven't even done the tilt and the pan all the way, but once I take this to a bigger room, we'll show those capabilities a little bit more. So this is what the image quality of the RC20 camera looks like at a little bit longer than arm's length away. Now, this camera is not designed for being used at this distance for the most part, and it can be a little bit finicky with the autofocus, and I'll demonstrate this now. And I want to clarify, it can be finicky with the autofocus when it's this close. I've found that when you get kind of further away, the autofocus really doesn't have too many problems staying on the subject at a faraway distance, but you may run into problems with the autofocus, and the way I've remedied that here is I've actually just gone into manual focus here. So I'm going to turn on autofocus now, and we can see it did hop and it got me that time, but one of the things that it could potentially do is have you out of focus, and I'm going to throw myself out of focus here just to show how this works, and the way that I get it in with manual. But down here we've got a manual button here, and we've got near and far, and that's how we take manual control of the focus. But I'm going to show you how the autofocus works here. I'm going to block out my face, and this is center focused autofocus. So there, it finally grabbed the card here that I've got in my hand and focused on that. If I take that away, it should focus back on my face, but I've noticed that at this distance sometimes it can struggle. So we can see that it's kind of pulsating a little bit here. If you hit the manual button here on the remote, you can take manual control of the camera, and then you can hit the near and far to dial in the focus. So now that we're on the topic of talking about this remote, we're going to go through what you can do with this remote and its other features too. So if you hit this menu button right here, that's going to bring up the qualities of the picture, and we can configure that. I've got everything configured manually right now for the what I feel is a pretty good picture for the lighting in this room, but you can go in and set the exposure. You can go from manual to SAE to bright to automatic, and you can go down through all of these different settings and configure that for the lighting in your room. Like I said, I think I've got it configured pretty good for the room set on manual now, so we're just going to go with that. Back through the rest of the settings, we've got color, and we can set the white balance through, I found that the one push is a pretty good way of setting the white balance, and this camera does capture white fairly accurately just by hitting the home button when you have it set on one push, and it's going to calculate and figure what the color is in the room and set it to that, and it's white balance now. But if you do want to go through and set a manual white balance in different modes, you actually can do that, or you can just set it on auto, which looks pretty good too. But I'm going to go back to one push and leave it there. In here we've got our image, and we can take up the luminance level or up or down, and we can take the contrast level up or down if we so choose, and we can go through and increase artificial sharpness if you so choose. We can flip the image both horizontally and vertically. We can turn black and white on, and we can change the gamma levels if we so choose. And we can go through different image styles as well. In our PTZ settings here, I leave speed by zoom on. We can set the autofocus zone from center to bottom to top. I leave it on center. That basically is going to keep the autofocus focusing in on what's in the center of the screen. We can turn the autofocus sense to high, low, normal. I leave it on high. We can flip the left and right pan here if we want. And display info, I'm not really sure what this does. I'll have to look that up. Preset speed, this is something that I'll talk about later with presets, but I like to keep this maxed out to its highest setting. This is basically how fast it's going to snap from one preset to the next. So we'll go back out, go through a couple of other settings here. Noise reduction, we can set the noise reduction here. I usually have this just on auto, and I think auto does a pretty good job of it. And then we can fine-tune this down here, and I'm just going to leave this second setting on off, maybe set it at 1. But we can see that if we turn noise reduction off, we'll see that there's quite a bit of noise in the picture, and there's some computational things going on to reduce the noise. So I like to just set this on auto and leave it there. In setup, you can come down here and flip the OSD if you would need to. And for communication setup, this is for setting up a PTZ controller into the RS232 port in the back of the camera. I don't have one of those, so I can't demonstrate how that's done. And down here we can restore the camera's default settings if we choose. So one of the coolest things that I think you can do with this camera is that you can add a preset to any of these buttons, any of the numerical buttons up here. So if I like this shot, but I also want to talk about this device here, I can put this on my desk and I can hit preset 1, and this is going to assign this preset to the number 1 button here on the remote. Now if I tilt down to the object that I want to talk about, I can hit preset 2, And now if I hit 1 on the number pad, it's going to snap back to me. And if I hit 2, it's going to snap back to the device on the desk here. And if I want to go in, say, on a tighter shot and set another preset, I can do that. So preset 3. So now if I hit the 1 button, it's going to snap back to me. And if I hit 2, it'll go back to the device here. And if I hit 3, it'll go tighter in on the device. So that's pretty handy if, say, you're running a live stream at a church and you want to have one shot, say, on the pastor at his desk thing that they use. Sorry, I'm not a religious guy. And you can have a second shot, say, on the choir. You can have a third shot maybe as an opening, establishing shot on the church, however you want to set it up. But you've got 10 of those presets that you can set, and it'll make it really easy to snap from one scene to the next. I think overall the image quality with the lighting looks pretty good. We did verify earlier that there is some computational things going on that's doing noise correction, and that's okay. I think it looks fine. Now the sensor size in this camera is a little bit smaller than what you would get out of a GoPro. This is a 1/2.7 inch sensor, and for keeping the cost down, it makes sense. Now I don't really have the lighting set up in here for green screen work, but if you do want to use this camera for green screen work, it should be pretty adequate in getting the job done, especially if you got a little bit better backlighting than what I've got here. And here are some zoom tests indoors, and when I step back into the next room, please keep in mind that I don't have the best lighting in the other room. And here at the maximum 10 times zoom, I'm about 35 to 40 feet away from the camera. And in very bright scenes, like this outdoor shot, the image absolutely will be overexposed. I don't think that's going to be a big deal for most use case scenarios, and I don't think this camera was ever designed for outdoor use. And though I would say it performs well in low light, I do believe it is optimized for indoor lighting. Zooming in does make the image darker and can help mitigate some of that overexposure because it will tighten the aperture, but there is no manual control over the aperture. So I wanted to do a comparison test between the Rocware RC20 and a couple of other cameras, and this is the first comparison test. This is the Insta360 Link webcam. Now I know this is an apples to oranges comparison, but we're working with what we got here, and for things that are in the same price range, this is a webcam that runs $300 in comparison to the Rocware RC20, which costs $250. This Insta360 Link also is a 4K webcam. Personally, I do think that the Insta360 Link does have a little bit better picture quality in comparison to the RC20, but let's take a look at them side by side. So here's what the two look like side by side. I do think that the Insta360 Link does have a little bit better picture quality, but it is a 4K webcam. The trade-off is that the Rocware RC20 has a optical zoom, which the zoom on the Insta360 Link is digital. Now, this is a PTZ camera, but there's no sort of auto tracking like what you would get with the Insta360 Link or the OBSBot, for example. You do have to control the pan and tilt with the remote or a controller if you have one, but as far as auto tracking a subject, it just doesn't exist with this camera, so be aware of that. And for my second comparison test, this is the Canon Vixia HFR 800. Now, this is a popular camera to be used for live streams like church events and things like that, for events that are on a budget, because this camera is easy to use and it has an extremely long zoom range. Now, the zoom on this does beat the RC20, but as you can see, the picture is not as good. under the exact same lighting conditions, and that's because the sensor size on the Canon Vixia is extremely, extremely small. So here's what the two look like side by side. And I think the RC20 definitely does beat the Canon Vixia, but again, the Canon Vixia does have a lot better zoom range. So up to this point, I've had overwhelmingly good things to say about this camera in general. Now, let's talk about some of the things that aren't so desirable with this camera, and a couple of these, admittedly, are just nitpicks. The first, the camera does not have a built-in mic, and I think that's okay because most PTZ cameras are going to rely on an external audio source anyway. But anybody who is expecting this camera to have a mic, just be aware that it does not. I already mentioned the finicky autofocus, so I'm not going to cover that again. And the next thing is that because this is such a low-budget PTZ camera, it is missing some of the output features that you would find on much more expensive PTZ cams. For example, it does not have a HDMI output, and it does not have a SDI output, but I think it's to be expected for a camera in this price point. And next, the frame rate could be an issue for some people who want to make sure that you have an actual frame rate of 30 frames per second. This is an HD 1080p webcam, and it claims that it can do 1080p at 30 frames per second, but in all of my tests, it does drop frames pretty badly. For a presentation like in a church or on a stage or something like that, where there's not a lot of movement going around, I don't think the frame rate is going to be an issue, but again, it should be noted that it's not a true 30 frames per second. It's probably closer to around 25 to 24 in that area, but it does seem to drop about every fifth or sixth frame in the tests that I've conducted. And my last major criticism of this camera is that if you have some crazy backlighting going on like what I've got over here, this camera is not going to handle that very well. If you have backlighting, say if I had that window open back there and it were daytime, it would really blow this image out, and this camera just doesn't handle harsh backlighting like that. So you got to keep in mind that if you are shooting a scene where there's a big window in the background, it may not be a very good looking image when it's all said and done. But I've tried to mitigate this by setting things both manually and going with automatic settings, and it just can't handle that the way that's set up. So those are pretty bright lights back there, but it's something that I feel like people should be aware of. As far as my final thoughts on this camera, I think that you're getting a really good value on this camera for the price, as long as you're aware of the limitations of this camera and you're able to work around them. However, I hope I've given you enough information to come to your own conclusion whether or not this is going to be a good purchase for you. As always, thank you so much for watching. That's it for now, and I'll see you next time.